Hello and welcome to the March edition of the Anomaly Archives Anomaly Academy patron monthly online presentations. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited about tonight's presentation, and I'm really thankful that you've all joined us to participate in these online lectures and to support the 501c3 nonprofit Anomaly Archives Scientific Anomaly Institute. As you already likely know, we are dedicated to the preservation of anomalous materials ranging from the anomalous nature of consciousness. What is consciousness? It's anything we call it. That could be psychic abilities, anomalous cognition, ESP, PSI, all those things. Psionics, the phrase of the day. As well as things like the Bermuda Triangle and ancient archaeology and fringe science, frontier physics, of course, our favorites, UFOs, UAP. But we are not UAPologists here. We are flying saucerologists and Forteans and seekers of strange information. And among the other areas that the Anomaly Archives covers is the subject of cryptozoology, the realms of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, lake monsters, and other mystery cryptids that so seemingly haunt our humanity's lives and our folklore and perhaps our physical reality. I'm excited to bring our guest tonight. You likely are already aware of him through his voluminous contributions to the UFO scene, as well as the frontier science scene and paranormal Fortean cryptozoology scenes. That is Micah Hanks. I think it was likely as far back as 2008 when I first became aware of his research and his writings through his then radio show and podcast, The Graylian Report. And I have kept abreast of his work ever since. And he has just continued to expand his areas of expertise and provide a vast wealth of material to this community and all the various sub-communities of the anomalies and Fortean scenes. And most often you probably see and hear him talking on the latest news, especially as it relates to UFOs and the paranormal. But his areas of interest extend into those areas of alternative archaeology and the zones of cryptozoology, as exemplified by his other one of many podcasts, the Sasquatch Tracks podcast. He's really gone to the next level with his co-founding and leadership on the Debrief. That's the debrief.org. But without further ado, let's bring on our good friend, Micah Hanks. Hey, Micah, how you doing?
Smiles, how are you, my friend? It is so good to be here.
I am doing well, and I've just been really looking forward to this, and I'm so thankful that you've took time out of your busy schedule. You are one of those. You are really the most active person I know in this field, who is walking the walk and out there hitting the streets and being very active and corralling a wealth of other writers and researchers in putting out the material that you put out through the Debrief, the debrief.org, as well as your wonderful website, micahhanks.com, where folks can find links to all your material, including, as mentioned, sasquatchtracks.com, I think, and Middle Theory and your Enigmas show. And for the last year or so, I finally, it took me a while, but I finally was like, gosh, this guy needs even more support because he's doing such great stuff. And I've been an ex-subscriber, really love every week, looking forward to the two different podcasts that you produce through micahhanks.com. And really, I don't get to hear enough of your cryptozoology work, but that's why I'm so excited about tonight's presentation. So before we begin, I did want to remind folks that at the end of the presentation, we'll have some time, hopefully, for comments and questions. You can put your comments into the chat on the side. And if you don't mind them being made public like this, oops, did that not help? Let's see. Yes, they will appear there if we choose to highlight them. Or if you want to not have your name or information displayed and just have us read the questions, you can type anon, ANON, for anonymous, and we'll do you that favor. But uh, thank you all, and let's go ahead and dive in, Micah. Let's bring up your slides, and I'm just going to hand the reins over to you. I'm just raring to go. Let's go.
Well, thank you so much, Smiles. First, let me say a couple of things. Smiles has been a friend of mine for many years, and I want to thank him and Victor so much for having me here. As you can see, I've got history and government on the title of this lecture about Sasquatch. You might say I psionically intuited that we might need to lower the temperature a little bit and stray away from the topic I normally discuss, which is unidentified anomalous phenomena, as the government prefers to refer to it. We're talking about, of course, the artists formerly known as UFOs, and many of us have been longtime purveyors of and also proponents of science being applied toward the study of that subject. And since 2017, with all the interest in that topic, two things really came to mind for me being a long-time person of interest, not only with regard to that subject, UAP, but also with regard to cryptozoology. More specifically, what we'll be looking at with this lecture is relict hominoids, essentially unrecognized anthropoid apes that may still exist that are sort of a holdover from our paleoanthropological past. And if that is a reality, if these are not some sociological phenomenon, and again, my purpose tonight is not to try and convince you these things are real, but it is to try and offer some historical parallels and I think really more importantly, context for the discussion. Many modern critics of these topics would say, well, phenomena like this doesn't just come to exist in the 1950s or something. It has to have had a history. And we know Sasquatch has no history. It just shows up in the 20s, Bigfoot in the 1950s. That's not how science happens. So this is all made up. There is indeed a deeper history to this for those who are willing to go look and those, again, who go off the beaten path. So all of that said, before I really dive into this, I think it's incumbent upon us to talk about the fact that because we are discussing history tonight, this is so very fundamental to what the work of the Anomaly Archives is all about. I mean, to preserve information about the past. Smiles and I were having a conversation earlier during our audio test off the mic about, some of our favorite researchers and people. I won't name them now. Wonderful people who have contributed for decades and whose work I hope will continue to be read for decades. They won't be here forever. And you never know who has come and who will be leaving the scene for various reasons, family, illness, life and death. Preserving knowledge sometimes is the most important thing, really always is when it comes to the sciences, because none of us remain forever, but the contributions that we make to knowledge can. So I would simply ask here at the outset, very much in line with what this conversation we're going to have is about, support the Anomaly Archives, support what Smiles and Victor and everyone are doing, help to ensure that there will be information for future generations, and that those who come into this in the next several generations, maybe well after we're all gone, that they'll still have access to this information. And if these things remain anomalous at that time, maybe the new generations who stumble into this, as we all did at some point, they will be able to benefit from the information that Smiles and the team are working so hard right now to preserve. That is so crucially important. And so I'll get off my soapbox, but I think it's very important, the work that's being done, support them, spread the word, let others know what they're up to. This is incredibly important. And in fact, it may pave the way toward new, not just understandings of existing science, it may pave the path toward new branches of science at some point in the future. And that's my hope really with regard to Sasquatch. As I mentioned, when we saw in 2017, there was a large article, I guess, medium length, but the point is there was a wide range of viewership that read this article in 2017 in the New York Times that revealed the extent to which the United States Department of Defense had been involved in the study of UFOs. And when this story breaks, people's natural reaction to that, many who had never really looked at UFOs seriously before that, or maybe only had a passing interest, they saw this and they said, well, if the government takes this stuff seriously, then maybe there really is something to it. And it led to a tremendous surge in interest. And having been someone who's been involved in the study of this for so long, myself, here at the ripe old age of 41. I mean, I've already got several decades actually behind me. I got involved at a very early age doing this. And in 2017, I remember thinking, how long before, now that people are beginning to recognize there could be a there with something like UFOs, how long until they entertain other possibilities? What if people start asking questions like, well, if we entertain the idea that life from other worlds may be out there, and, however remote the possibility may seem that it could be coming here, is it really such a stretch to presume that there could be other forms of life on planet Earth that are not currently recognized by science? But taking that general premise a little further, the next questions I asked were, well, but how can we establish that through well documented source material in two of the very best forms of information? Again, information that is collected and preserved by the Anomaly archives. Historical records. Primarily, we want firsthand primary sources, but also secondary sources that provide context for historical records. And then also governmental records, records that are produced by official bodies within the United States or other governments that yet again may provide official resources documenting information related to things like UFOs, which we've already seen. Could the same hold true for something like Sasquatch? So I began with that initial premise a few years ago and went in search of really interesting quality historical and governmental data about the Sasquatch subject. And that is what we will now be discussing with our lecture. Sasquatch history and government. And you'll notice that throughout the talk this evening, I preferentially use that term relict hominoids. It is essentially the same thing as what colloquially we might say, is called Sasquatch, Bigfoot. I probably say Bigfoot the least of all those. I think, frankly, it's a very silly name. It's probably the most well-known name, unfortunately. But in my opinion, if I'm going to use a name, I prefer Sasquatch. I know other longtime researchers and those who have followed this topic and really communicated the science side of this, like Lauren Coleman and others for many years have said similar things. They preferentially will say Sasquatch or they will say relict hominoids. So those are the two terms you'll hear the most this evening as we dive into this topic. And we are going to be looking first again at the history, the historical perspectives on this. Why look at the history? I think I've already explained with the importance of what Smiles and the team are doing down there, why we need history, why history must be preserved, why it's so important that future generations can have access to the information that is being collected and the information that we're, studying right now. And one of the reasons for that is, again, that very argument that, well, Sasquatch doesn't exist because there is no history. There is nothing about this topic that supports the idea that people have known of these things for centuries, or thousands of years. Is that necessarily true? It seems to me that in likelihood, people have not gone and looked at the history quite so deeply as they should have. Now, in recent years, we have begun to see a number of researchers who are going deeper into the history of this topic. Chad Arment has published now several revised volumes of The Historical Bigfoot, which is a publication that has collected newspaper accounts and other early accounts documenting the history of this. But another source for historical information on this topic also can be found in traditional knowledge that conveyed primarily by indigenous traditions. And since we're talking about the American Sasquatch, again, this could apply to indigenous traditions shared by people in all parts of the world. But we're going to be looking at indigenous American folklore and also people who came to North America and who interacted with indigenous Americans from different countries in centuries past, and the kind of documentation that they provided about cultural beliefs. Now, it is important to point out some of the beliefs that we will look at here may not relate to the cultural concept we have today of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I think that what we will look at are good potentials, but I know that many skeptics will point this out and say, it's wrong, it's cultural appropriation, you can't really project your hope for the existence of Sasquatch onto these, indigenous traditions. So I want to be very clear. My hope is to look at the ones that seem to be a good fit for the modern cultural idea with respect to those traditions, not to try and paint onto them what we all hope or believe about the idea of a creature like Sasquatch. And I think you'll find and you'll agree that the selections we'll look at, some of these really are, I think, a good fit for our general idea. We go back first here to this account from 1792 by Jose Mariano Mozino, where he had traveled to the Northwest and spoken with the Nootka tribe And again, from 1792, he has this account of a being in the Nootka traditions of what is known as the Matlocks. And as he describes it, I do not know what to say about Matlocks, inhabitant of the mountainous district of whom all have an unbelievable terror. They imagine his body is very monstrous, all covered with stiff black bristles, a head similar to a human one, but with much greater, sharper, and stronger fangs than those of the bear. Extremely long arms and toes and fingers armed with long curved claws. His shouts alone, they say, force those who hear them to the ground, and any unfortunate body he slaps is broken into 1,000 pieces. Anyway, they go on to describe other aspects of his character, including the fact that the Matlocks is believed to leave just one footprint in line. And some of these elements are a little strange, a little hard to interpret. I have my own ideas about the single footprint, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, what we'll really focus on here are the fact that they describe a body that is monstrous. They describe stiff black bristles, but again, that could be a description of hair. It certainly sounds very much like the kind of plumage, I guess, that we would associate with a creature like Sasquatch. A head similar to a human one, which appears to make a distinction between the way that this creature and maybe that of a bear or another known mammal might look. Extremely long arms, toes and fingers armed with curved claws, etc., etc. We also have the shouts. And this is a characteristic that is to this day very commonly associated with, cultural ideas about Sasquatch. When you watch television programs, so often you'll see the Sasquatch hunters go out into the forest and they engage in the calls because in truth there are recordings, audio recordings that appear to convey strange sounds that are not very easily reconciled with known fauna in North America. On that point, rather than referencing the things that we see on popular television shows, I'll actually reference, and this is sort of foreshadowing what we'll get into with the government side of all this. But I've spoken with park rangers at Yellowstone National Park. I've spoken with people who have worked in other areas of government, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Department of the Interior, etc. And many of them have described either hearing stories of or firsthand experiences where they have heard these long calls that they say are fundamentally wolf-like, but in a very different register. They remind them more of like a human. One Yellowstone ranger had described it to me as like a crazed Tarzan yell that he had heard. And so the description of the shouts alone forcing those who hear them to the ground, all of these things are, we might say, suspiciously similar to the modern idea of Sasquatch. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect, having been translated from Mozino's original account from 1792, but this is a very early one and certainly one worth considering. We have this one that Lauren Coleman had actually found and published in the Info Journal back, I believe, in the 1970s. I think Mark A. Hall had also been the other researcher working with him at the time. And they found this very interesting tradition describing among the Micmac indigenous Americans the Gugwes. To read briefly from this description, these cannibals have big hands and hairy faces like bears. If one saw a man coming, he would lie down and beat his chest, producing a sound like a partridge. Now, of course, Coleman and Hall speculated about the possible connection between the sound and the tone of a partridge. In other words, again, the kind of vocalization we were just talking about, which indeed is worthy of consideration. To provide another perspective on this, and again, I'm a huge fan of both of the aforementioned researchers here, but just to provide a slightly different perspective on this, the idea of lying down and beating the chest to produce a sound like a partridge. I want you to watch the following video where we have essentially a grouse in nature when it begins doing what's known as drumming. And anyone who's been out there in the forest and encountered a grouse in nature, you'll have probably heard this. It can be very frightening at times. Wait until you hear the sound that the partridge makes. Well, it looks like it's vanished, but I think I got to skip ahead a little more here. There it is. Okay. This is provided courtesy of the Ruffed Grouse Society. Listen now carefully to the sound that this creature makes as it begins its drumming. Well, it looks like it's frozen up here, guys, so give it just a moment. Hopefully the video will play. Well, yeah, I'm getting the wonderful, colorful, winning spinning wheel. So if that needs a restart, if I vanish for a moment, I'll let you know. Hopefully, it'll catch up here in just a second. To give you an idea, though, of the kind of sound that we're describing and giving the video a moment to catch up, a ruffed grouse does not. I mean, it will make the kind of one tone whistling sound when it makes its vocalization. The drumming sound is very different. It's effectively like this, and I hope that's coming across the microphone fairly well right there. It's effectively a drumming that sounds very much like what you would expect an actual drumming of a of a drum to sound like, or perhaps we might say primate intimidation displays. The other video that unfortunately is not cooperating with me right now, and therefore is going to give us just a moment. But the video will actually show, once we get that up, a gorilla engaging in that same chest beating. And once you have the side by side comparison between these two, my interpretation of that Micmac tradition of the Gugwes as making a partridge like sound where it lays down, beats its chest, and sounds like a partridge, it sounds like they're describing a very distinctive primate like behavior of chest beating. With that said, let me just try really quickly, Victor and Smiles. I'm going to try and just see if I can force quit.
Okay. I was gonna
Yeah,
say, I think I may be able to play that on my end.
yeah. The problem is, though, it seems that PowerPoint has just frozen, and it's probably more of a resource issue than anything. I don't know why it's done that, but if you'll just give me just a second, I'll try and see if I can exit out of that. Worst case scenario, yeah, it looks like I've got access to the browser. Okay, so that's no trouble. But worst case scenario, I may have to actually jump off very briefly, restart. We'll get that up and back at the proper slide once we reconvene. Let me see if it's possible, though, for me just to force quit that. Yeah, there we go. That might allow us to do it, and then I can bring it back up and share again. So, ladies and gentlemen at home, I know you're riveted to see a ruffed grouse drumming in the wild. So, you'll just stand by. We will have that here in mere moments. The force quit should do it. Yeah, it says PowerPoint is not responding. So, there we go. Okay. Let me try reopening that really quickly, and I may just need you, Victor, to assist us very briefly with getting that back into the, let's see, where do we go there? Once I find the lecture here. Okay, here we are. Once I share that again, I'm going to try and pick back up at the same spot where we were. Actually, unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this back up in just a second here. Smiles, I realize now that the version that I sent you earlier has the updates. I want to make sure that we have all the updated information for the lecture, which was in the version that you received today. So let me get that in here. Open it from the version that I shared with you. There we go. Okay. Now we've got it. And try and jump right back in with that nice ruffed grouse footage there for us. Okay, stand by. I'm going to try and get that into the mix. Oh, go slideshow. Oh, we're almost there. Okay, there we go. We've got to play from the correct slide now. Okay, Victor, if you want to go ahead here in just a second, I will have that up and sharing the screen with you now. There we go. All right, I think we're back in business now. Okay, there we go. We've got it. Sorry about that, everybody. So, just to give again some of this the context in advance of what we're about to see in this video, granted that it plays correctly this time. As the Gugwes was described by the Micmac, they described the chest beating. We also have this interesting tradition among the Tete Boule, and this described by the Reverend Joseph E. Guinard back in the early 1920s, where they described the Witico, which it seems to be a variant on the idea of the Wendigo, which we find among many of the Midwestern and also Canadian indigenous tribes. They describe yet again remarkably similar characteristics associated with this creature. Wichicos have never been numerous, the account reads. At most, one or two of them wander around the country, and this only from time to time. Sometimes there are none for many years. But they go on to say that the voice of the Wichicos was strident and frightful and more reverberating than thunder. The sound of his voice was a long drawn out one, accompanied with fearful howls. Yet again, that description of the vocalization. When the Wichico happened upon the trail of anyone, now listen, this is very important. He waited until darkness fell to go and eat the luckless victim. When the Wichico had arrived close to the tent of his victim, his heart beat twice with joy upon his breast, making a sound like that which grouse make when they drum. So here we have two different traditions among indigenous Americans describing a human-like beast that creates a beating sound similar to the ruffed grouse. Here now, let's see if the video will give us an example, and I hope you're able to hear this audio. This is essentially what they're describing right here. Now that is the audio that they are describing, the sound that they're associating with these creatures, this grouse-like drumming. Compare that now to this footage that was provided by Diane Fossey of the Gorilla Fund, where we actually have a gorilla engaging in chest beating, which can be an intimidation display. It can be other things as well. But listen again and compare that to what we just heard of the ruffed grouse. Now, in that video, this is really interesting. I'm going to try to play that again. We get both the vocalization there, but also the beating sound. Sounds very distinctively like primate-like behavior that's being described in indigenous American accounts that describe various creatures, Gugwes, Wichico, and others. Now, yet again, I understand that there are some who would say, yes, but the Wendigo is a completely different thing from Sasquatch. This is a human that transforms into a beast, almost like an undead type creature. You know, the time that they spend outside, it causes their lips to recede, and they have all these very ghastly characteristics. That's true. But I think that it's important to recognize that there are probably a variety of different cultural interpretations and different variations that are shared from one cultural group to another, one tribe or indigenous American clan or group. And it very well may be that there's some crossover and some very obvious distinctions between some of those manifestations from one culture to the next. So to say that the Wendigo concept of one group might be different and that the name may be applied differently and even spelled differently, as we saw there in the Reverend's account, Witico with the T as opposed to the Wendigo with the ND, I think it's very possible that it could be applied in certain ways and a name used for a creature much more like our recognized Sasquatch. Moving forward a little, although this account is from the same era in which the paper describing those earlier Tete de Boulay beliefs originated from the 1920s, there's a fascinating book that was written by Wiley Blanchett titled The Curve of Time. And this also shares a very interesting tidbit in that, actually, we'll back up. In that book, Blanchett is traveling up and down the west coast with her children one summer, and they're visiting tribes, and they're going and they're talking with people and just, observing the Pacific Northwestern coast. And at one point they're in a inn and they're talking with a hunter, and the hunter describes having had the most frightening experience as he's just telling stories about, his time in the wilderness. And his experience had been that he said that he found himself caught out in a storm one night and took shelter in a cave. And that the whole time he was sheltering in the cave, he said that there were grizzly bears that walked around outside the cave he was sheltering in, and they beat their chests. Now, of course, this is a behavior that is not associated at all with ursids. I know of no instances where a bear beats its chest, but this is certainly something that primates would engage in. And so yet again, it very well may be another description of similar primate-like behavior that's documented in the 1920s in a popular book by Wiley Blanchett. Now, this is one of the most intriguing accounts, in my opinion. We have George Gibbs, the American ethnologist, and yet again, he traveled and he met and spoke with many indigenous groups throughout the Pacific Northwest. There was a portion of his book that was published, I believe, in the believe it was the 1860s or 70s, that was removed. And Gibbs' great granddaughter finds this, and he provides a copy of this, an excerpt of which we actually have on the screen right now, to the Oregon Historical Society in the 1940s. And in other words, what had happened was the original manuscript prior to publication had been archived, found by the descendant of George Gibbs, and then passed along to a historical society. Very, very interesting description provided in that portion that did not make it into the final version of the book for whatever reason, we don't know. But he describes the following. There's one other race of beings I've classed separately, as they in particular are supposed to infest the earth and do not appear to have been properly elliptilicum. Now, that term, by the way, is used to denote supernatural beings, which are not supposed to be manifest physical beings. These are, creatures that sort of extend beyond the physical, as we might say. So, as he says, these beings that are being described by these, in the beliefs of these cultures, these are not spirit beings. They appear to be physical, i.e., they infest the earth. They are the Siatko in the upper Chehalis, Stay Tatl, or in Klickitat, the Shiaha. The belief in these beings is apparently universal among different tribes, though there is a great discrepancy in their accounts of them. Again, to the earlier point, by the way, about similarity of names, but different potential applications of those from time to time from one group to another. That's something that must be recognized with respect to each individual group's cultural beliefs. By some, the Siatko are described as of gigantic size. Their feet 18 inches long and shaped like a bear's. They wear no clothes, but the body is covered with hair like that of a dog, only not so thick. Others describe them as of natural size and resembling men, except that they gibber and chatter, one Siatko making noise enough to represent a dozen persons. They are said to live in the mountains in holes underground and to smell badly. They come down chiefly in the fishing season, at which time the Indians are excessively afraid of them. At the report of Siatko, they all run for their houses, fire their guns, and shout. They are visible only at night, at which time they approach the houses, steal salmon, carry off young girls, and smother children. Their voices are like that of the owl, and they possess the power of charming so that those hearing them become demented or fall down in a swoon. Now, that last portion, of course, talking about mesmerism being exhibited by the Siatko. This is something that my colleagues have addressed, namely Matt Pruitt. And if those out there have not read Matt Pruitt's excellent book that came out recently, The Phenomenal Sasquatch, Matt takes great pains to identify how supernatural beliefs are often associated with known animal species. For instance, many groups have associated the stalking abilities of tigers and other predators with being ghost-like. So to assume that a creature like the so-called Siatko might possess mesmerism or the ability to mesmerize its prey, the power of charming, this could be one of these projections of a sort of supernatural trait onto an actual physical creature. And again, keep in mind, even George Gibbs' assessment that these appear to infest the earth. They do not appear to be properly of the spirit folk, the elliptilicum, as others are. But look at the more distinctive characteristics associated with the Siatko in this account collected in the mid-19th century by George Gibbs in his ethnological research. I mean, 18-inch long feet. The Siatko themselves are of gigantic size. They wear no clothes, but their hair is covered, or their body is covered in hair. And he doesn't say fur, he says covered in hair, and he likens it to that of a dog, only not so thick. Very specific in that description. He talks about the vocalizations, not only gibbering and chattering, but also making owl-like sounds. Think back to Coleman and Hall's description of the one-tone whistle of the Paradix being the actual species, but essentially of the pigeon. Note that he also talks about them living in the mountains. He discusses how people are frightened of them, how they are only visible at night. I don't think this means that they are invisible in the daytime. I think this means they are probably best known for nocturnal behavior. And yet again, also, we have this trope that is something that's consistent throughout numerous indigenous traditions of the kidnapping of young girls and children. That, again, is a discussion for another time. But, I mean, this is a fascinating sort of sub-area within the study of this phenomenon. And I've often wondered about anthropological questions of how would a species in decline behave in order to essentially to ensure the continuance of its genetic line, right? When you face population decline, it may not be something that they are aware of, but again, you're going to go out there, you're going to try and find mates, you're going to try and engage in looking for others like you. And it very well may be that if such things as relict hominoids exist, that behavior is described in many of the legends, but referred to as kidnappings. So this account, again, fascinating, and we wouldn't have known about this if the original documents of George Gibbs that didn't make their way, some of them, to publication, had not been preserved and provided to a historical society in the 1940s. Just fascinating to me. And yet again, a very, very good match, even better than the account from Mozino that we saw earlier, and some of the ones involving the Witico and the Gugwes. The Gibbs account from the mid-19th century, of almost perfect fit for our modern idea of a Sasquatch. But there are others. Here are just a few examples. We're not going to stop and read all of these, but I'll just tell you that these 3 newspaper articles that we have on the screen here, they all share one thing in common. Well, a few things, but one primary thing in common. They're all from 1904, but they are all slightly different descriptions. 2, I believe, from British Columbia, and then 1 from Oregon. We have one on each end, Victoria on the left, Vancouver on the right, and then the one from the middle there from Oregon, Wild Man in Coos County, Oregon. And these descriptions, again, if you look at some of the ways that they describe the being, the so-called wild man, the wild man from the instance in Victoria, British Columbia, the wild man was apparently young with long and matted hair and beard and covered with a profusion of hair all over the body. It's not to say that a human being couldn't be covered in hair like that. There certainly are such conditions as hypertrichosis, which causes profuse hair growth all over the body. But again, these descriptions of these wild men do seem to describe something slightly different from human. Look at the instance with the wild man in Coos County. He is believed to be an insane prospector, but of gigantic stature. Very interesting. Of muscular build, 7 feet tall, and very unkempt. Again, these descriptions are very suggestive of something large, something humanoid, but something hairier than the average human. 1924, we really had a turning point, however, when it comes to establishing the history of this subject. And this, of course, this is a pretty well-known case, the incident at Ape Canyon. Mark Mersell, my friend and colleague, gets a shout out for this one because, as far as historical researchers, no one has gone so deep into this case. And furthermore, I would say that really maybe no researcher recently has gone quite so deep into the history of this topic with a single case of any kind regarding Sasquatch or relict hominoids as Mark Mersell has done with this. And it just goes to show that anyone who thinks, well, if there's anything out there that could be found, it's already been found. Think again. Mark Mersell and his research should be an anchor point for future endeavors and to inspire others. Grab a case. Take one that maybe you think there's only a couple of newspaper articles about. Start doing the genealogical research. Start looking at the geography. Start looking into, census records and all kinds of other available historical records. Suddenly you will find that there's probably a lot more data that exists than people have ever gone to look for. And Mark Mersell has demonstrated that with his incredible historical research into the Ape Canyon incident. But for the purposes of our conversation, I want to try and point out something extraordinarily important here. Note this newspaper article selection that I've featured here. And I actually have the word ape men highlighted in pink for you there. Look at the title of the article, Tribe of Ape Indians Reported Found in Pacific Northwest. Now, I want to be very clear. Especially in the modern dialogue, we have to be very careful how we discuss cultural beliefs, traditions, the likenesses of these creatures, again, because we're talking about what are apparently anthropoid apes. And I have had experiences giving talks where I have pointed out newspaper articles like this that, written in the parlance of their day, had a very different meaning than perhaps how some would interpret it today. And I've had to explain that to people. We've had some very interesting circumstances arise. So I want to be very clear in saying this is the parlance of the day, but the reason it is significant right now is because the description of apes and ape-like beings encountered during the famous 1924 Mount St. Helens incident at Ape Canyon is because there has been in more recent years an effort to try and argue that descriptions of Sasquatch prior to around 1955 had only always ever described large humans. And this is really kind of a misunderstanding that arose from the research of one of the best known, one of the iconic researchers who was the first to really get in on this and start trying to establish the existence of the creature and whether there was a history to support that belief. That was John Green, the Canadian researcher, newspaper writer. And John Green had been the very one who had said, early on, the descriptions of Sasquatch were basically just, as he termed it, giant Indians. But he said by the time 1955 rolls around, I meet a hunter who I correspond with, a man by the name of William Rowe. And William Rowe describes what is undeniably a creature that resembles a large ape, a primate. And he said suddenly Sasquatch takes on a whole different meaning. These aren't just giant people, they are actually something more like a primate. There have been some researchers who have really kind of locked in on that. And by the way, just briefly, I'll point out this is the 1929 article that first appeared in Maclean's magazine, introducing British Columbia's hairy giants by J.W. Burns. This was the first time that we see the word Sasquatch in print. Sasquatch, actually, which is kind of a bastardization of a Halkomelem term, Saskatale, I think, or something along those lines would be more how they would pronounce it. Burns took a couple of different variations, mashed those together, anglicized it, and came up with Sasquatch. That first appears in 1929. Nonetheless, it was this article and others that Green referred to where he says, these were pretty much just described as large people. There were no big, hairy, ape-like creatures until about 1955. And that point was really emphasized in a book written, actually co-authored, one of the two authors of that, a fine Canadian researcher by the name of Daniel Loxton. Donald Prothero was the other author. And the title of their book is Abominable Science. And I want to be very clear. I think these gentlemen did an excellent job with the book and that it should be read. Although I do disagree with some of the findings that are printed in the book. And I've had a lot of people get upset with me for pointing this out, but I think as a matter of historical accuracy and with respect to Mr. Loxton especially, it should just be pointed out. As he writes in that book, Abominable Science, he says, before Rose citing eyewitnesses in the Fraser Valley had described Sasquatches as fundamentally human in appearance and behavior as we were discussing, he goes on to write that for all its influence, the Rowe case, and briefly to discuss what this is referring to, John Green receives this correspondence where a man named William Rowe in 1955 hunting on Micah Mountain, wonderful name for a mountain, I guess, but he observes a creature come down out of the forest, walk across a field, and it starts eating leaves off of a tree until apparently becomes aware of his presence, kind of looks in his direction, stands up, and it walks back up the mountain. And it's a fairly lengthy encounter as far as Sasquatch sightings go. It lasts a few minutes. But Mr. Rowe comes forward only in, I believe, 1947, saying, I think I saw one of those things that Mr. Green, you're talking about, these so-called Sasquatches. And again, the way he describes it was very much like a large hirsute primate. Nonetheless, referring to the earlier writings of John Green and John Green's interpretation at the time, the early Sasquatch reports described just large people, nothing primate-like. Mr. Loxton writes in Abominable Science that, the Rowe case is ultimately a story told by an unknown figure for unknown reasons, under unknown circumstances, because there's absolutely nothing to corroborate this story, he says. A great deal of ink has been spilled in arguing that Rowe's sworn statement renders the account reliable. And it is true that William Rowe actually had produced a affidavit stating, this is what I saw and my account is true and accurate. In any case, Loxton has argued that does not necessarily make the case rock solid, and he's right to make that argument. He also goes on to say no one did that with Rowe. He said, we have no idea whether his story was consistent from telling to telling, and in fact, we don't even know what William Rowe really looked like. Now, Loxton's making some very good points. Yes, he is coming at this from a skeptical perspective, but he's saying, to substantiate a case like this, we can't just read what past writers have written and say, yeah, that guy signed an affidavit, so the story must be true. Where are the photos of William Rowe? And is there any other information that helps us to establish the historical truth and accuracy of this story? Furthermore, there we go. These are a couple of images of William Rowe. One on the left, you can see where he's holding a gun as an older man. The one on the right is William Rowe as a younger man. There are actually others available online, but I don't have the proper licensing to be able to show them right now. But the important point is that thanks to the digitization of historical documentation, we have begun to find that there's actually quite a lot of information, a lot of photographs even, of William Rowe that existed and which were not as easily accessible at the time that, for instance, the book Abominable Science was written. So with credit to Daniel Loxton, it's not that he didn't go and look for these things. It's that with the data available to him at that time, he wasn't able to find them. And I think that also is an important point to make with the digitization of information, with the collections of archives like the Anomaly archives and others. More and more information is becoming accessible, and stuff that researchers couldn't find a few years ago and would have dismissed out of hand, it's now beginning to come to light. And as Loxton wrote at that point, he even said, John Kirk, a well-known Canadian Royal Mounted Police officer, but also a Sasquatch researcher, Kirk had written to Loxton and said that he believed that Rowe's story had appeared in the Province and the Sun in 1957 prior to August. As Loxton said, and he went and he did the hard work. He went to newspaper archives looking for it, and he said, unfortunately, I did long searches through microfilm, and I was unable to find Rowe's original lost account. Fortunately, it did come to light, and we now have it. You can actually find it on newspapers.com. This is the missing article. And as you can see, there's this very humorous rendering right there of a Sasquatch woman looking at herself in the mirror. She's, bejeweled and everything. And then there's little William Rowe back there in the background watching her. But there's the photograph of the older William Rowe posing with his shotgun. We now have that information. And again, there have been some who have been very upset that I point this out, and they think that I'm trying to diminish Daniel Loxton's perspectives on this. He made very important points. We do need to be able to find this information, but it has only been in more recent years that it has become available through the digitization of these kinds of documents. And so to me, that is progress, and it's not to take away from anybody else's research, but some things that some have said did not exist or could not be found, they have come to light. And indeed, not only was there the print article with a photograph of William Rowe that tells us what he looks like and does substantiate that he had told his story by that time, as reported by Don Laurie in the Province and Sun in 1957. But furthermore, more recently, an archived radio interview with William Rowe describing his encounter has also appeared. And you can find that on the YouTube channel of the Sasquatch Archives, which is excellent. And it is run by Todd Prescott. So you can just go on YouTube and search for the Sasquatch Archives. So some brief preliminary conclusions here, which I've already kind of talked about. And we still have to get into the government side of this, which I'll try to make good haste with. But again, my belief is that if, in a fundamental sense, with the United States government paying attention to subjects like UAP, we would do well to see, firstly, whether there's good historical documentation that supports the idea of similar subjects in areas of inquiry like Sasquatch. But furthermore, if there's government documentation on UAP, I mean, why not look for the same with regard to Sasquatch? Could there be government records that could help establish not only additional historical context for this subject, but maybe also that would potentially point to the reality of this creature if such exists? So this next portion here we'll be discussing is Sasquatch and government. Again, admittedly, this is fairly new research. There are only a few other researchers who are really involved in this, and I've corresponded with or met almost all of them. But as soon as I say that, somebody out there will have filed FOIA requests and been involved, and I won't have heard from them, and I'll get an email. So if you or anyone you know, in the words of Robert Stack and Unsolved Mysteries, is involved in this kind of research, I'd love to correspond with you. Some of my initial inquiries, though, I began with the National Park Service under the United States Department of Interior. A very natural place to start, considering that protected wildernesses, national parks, etc., are where a lot of people claim that they have Sasquatch encounters. There's a very good reason for that, right? And I don't think we have to get into all the reasons. Again, it's pretty self-evident. You get out away from the urban sprawl of major population areas and out into the remote wilds. This specifically in the Western United States is where people say they often have Sasquatch encounters. By no means the only places, but that generally tends to be kind of the trend. And I reached out to Yellowstone Park because I'd begun to hear some very interesting stories shared by rangers from that area. And I asked them officially, what would you do if a creature like this were confirmed to exist in the park? What is the park's policy? What is the National Park Service's policy? And they said, We don't have any confirmed sightings of a Sasquatch in the park. As such, we cannot speculate on our response if one was discovered in the park. I sympathize with the National Park Service employees. I'm sure they don't want to have to answer questions like this. It's also worth noting that a confirmed sighting is a very specific thing. If I say I saw, for instance, a mountain lion in Yellowstone Park, they might say, okay, cool. Thank you for letting us know. Hey, Jerry, go ahead and log this. We've had an unconfirmed sighting of a mountain lion. Unconfirmed because I said I saw it. It's anecdotal evidence. A confirmed sighting with regard to wildlife behavior in a national park, for instance, would be where you have not only a sighting, but a sighting that can be corroborated with physical evidence, i.e., footprints. If there, for instance, was a killing and DNA could be retrieved from bite or claw marks, and they can determine conclusively that there had been a mountain lion there present at that kill site, this would be a confirmed sighting. What would also constitute confirmed sightings in the case of a known animal species like mountain lions would also be photographic or video evidence. So why those things don't apply to a Sasquatch is pretty simple, although it took a while to kind of dig into this with Park Service rangers and understand their criteria. It really comes down to, for Sasquatch or any other animal, there would have to be a type specimen by which, again, a known species can be established and thereby comparisons can be made. But when you add to that the fact that, well, a person in a suit, standing there and looking like a Sasquatch, that could, again, account for photos and videos. And in many instances, unfortunately, it probably does. A lot of hoaxes, people putting on suits and, getting out there and traipsing through fields and things with someone conveniently filming it. When you add to the issue of there not being a type specimen in our possession, the fact that a human can fairly easily hoax the appearance of a Sasquatch, it makes it much harder to say that we have confirmed sightings. In other words, a known species, sure, video looks great, but if I see what looks like it might be a person and I don't have a type specimen by which to compare an alleged Sasquatch sighting, it's unconfirmed. And hence, Yellowstone and the National Park Service more broadly, they say we don't have any confirmed sightings of Sasquatch. And I understand their position on that. That is a technically true and accurate statement. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people, including federal government employees, who say that they have had encounters with these creatures and seen them themselves. This gentleman right here, Bob Jackson, nickname is Action Jackson. Bob, for around 30 years, patrolled the thoroughfare portion of Yellowstone Park. The thoroughfare is a tremendous portion of wilderness that is essentially the furthest that you can get from a road anywhere in the contiguous 48. And so Bob would either patrol on horseback or on foot, but mostly on horseback. As he was in the early, probably 70s or 1980s, as he recalls it, he was coming in off of a trail, and this is his account. He said his horse began bucking up, and he figured that there was a grizzly in this alpine glade below him. As he describes it, he sees a deer bolt out of one of these little thickets down there in this glade, and he says, then right coming out of the other side was this thing that was running on 2 feet. It was black like a bear, and it had long arms and ran. I think I held it there 30 seconds, but it got scared and then it came out. It ran, but not super fast. It ran to another thicket and then went at an angle out of the thicket to another thicket about 40 to 50 yards away. Now, as he notes, he says the thing would go from a position of cover to the next, and then it would run to another position of cover, hide for a few seconds, and then it would run again. He said grizzlies, first of all, run on all fours. This thing was running on 2 legs. Grizzlies will go in a straight line. They're not going to try and run from point of position of concealment to concealment. He says they'll just take off. This thing was intelligent, was trying to prevent itself from being seen, and it would run, hide, wait, run, hide, wait. And it did that until eventually it was out of sight. So here we have this, decades of experience behind Mr. Jackson, this ranger, saying this was no hoax. I've ridden maybe 50 to 70,000 miles in the backcountry on horses, and you encounter a lot of bears when you do that. This thing, whatever it was, the horses looked straight down to it. He said it was no bear. That is an incredible encounter, in my opinion. And it's one of several, in fact, described by U.S. Federal government employees. Here we have 2 U.S. Geological Survey employees, actually, who had been working in Yellowstone. I believe the year was 1976 or 7. This is taken from a Bigfoot Field Research Organization report, and I've got it listed there. It's a Class A encounter, report number 1241. They were coming in late at night, and as they note, they were coming in on one of the roads that leads into Yellowstone. It was approximately 1 a.m. at that time, and they see this figure. They said that they felt was they were moving about 45 miles per hour as they're coming up. He said at first it looked first at the vehicle. We noticed the yellow reflection from its eyes as seen in a dog's eye when light catches it at night, then deliberately turned its head away from the lights. That motion was non-human or bear-like in that the shoulders, chest, and head moved simultaneously as it caught sight of our vehicle and then turned its face away from the headlights. They described it as a hominid creature, perhaps 7 to 7.5 feet in height, massing perhaps 600 to 800 pounds without obvious signs of obesity, standing completely and comfortably upright, which came up out of the ditch from the left side of the road, right at the edge of the metal barrier above the culvert, takes 3 extraordinarily long and fluid strides across the highway, another 3 or 4 shorter strides down the other side of the road, and held onto the metal barrier with one of the long-fingered, hairy hands as it swung down under the road into the box culvert or channel below them, completely out of their line of sight. So again, 2 observers, USGS employees, working in Yellowstone in the late 1970s, coming in late at night and encounter this while traveling along a road. And we have others too. Another ranger, Orville Butch Bach, who wrote an excellent book about his experiences at Yellowstone. Not all of them, or any of them except for one, really having to do with Sasquatch. But the first chapter in one of his recent books about this describes an experience that he and 3 other hikers had, yet again in the thoroughfare. And interestingly, he was a skeptic. He had already met another fellow ranger who had claimed to have seen something that resembled a Sasquatch around Electric Peak. And Orville didn't believe that, but he said, "I believe that you believe you saw something," he told his friend. It wasn't maybe 2 years later that Mr. Bach and others were camping in the thoroughfare when they encountered something that again produced vocalizations, which he likens to a crazed Tarzan scream. There's another ranger by the last name of Henderson that's mentioned in Mr. Bach's book, I Have Spoken to Henderson on the telephone. I was told at that time by Ranger Henderson about photos of an alleged gorilla that were taken in the park in the 1990s. He gave me the name of a Ursid specialist with the park who might have had copies of that, who I finally spoke with, and unfortunately, he was unable to verify that those photos still existed, but he seemed to have remembrance of there being photographs that were taken. What they actually showed is anybody's guess. Boy, I wish I could have gotten those before they vanished. So a lot of interesting stories coming out of Yellowstone. Briefly, I'll also just talk about incidents at Crater Lake National Park. You'll notice that, again, by targeting national parks, I'm able to send FOIA requests to these various components within the Department of the Interior. And that's the whole purpose, to get official documentation, records, or information that may relate to Sasquatch sightings that have occurred, and specifically that have been made by federal government employees. As we've seen, there are several rangers at Yellowstone who they themselves have said that they have had these experiences themselves. I found others at Crater Lake who describe similar things. These 2 gentlemen, Larry and Lloyd Smith, were incredibly helpful. They have compiled over the last several decades a chronological history of Crater Lake National Park. And in that history, I found a couple of interesting sightings that occurred in the 1970s. One, which had been by George Morrison, who at the time was the park's chief naturalist. He said he saw something cross the road at about dusk as he was heading into Annie Creek Canyon. According to the account by Larry and Lloyd in their chronological history, Morrison said the upright creature took only 4 steps to cross the road. An experienced nature observer, he said he couldn't find any footprints, but he was shaken by the sighting. I was so intrigued by this that I filed FOIA requests. Here's a brief screenshot of my the actual response that was sent to me from that FOIA request that I filed on July 26th, 2019. And they essentially just said they searched park records. Unfortunately, by that period, the statute, I guess, of limitations had already passed. There were no records at that time that would have been in their holdings. Anything after 40 years, as they say, would have passed on to probably the National Archives in Denver, Colorado. And they were saying, you can't get that information from us. You'd have to go to Denver and have a historian at the archives help you with that. Now, when I brought this to the attention of Larry and Lloyd, they were so thrilled to see that I was taking interest in their work. They said, "Hey, guess what? George Morrison, who is the park naturalist, we're still in touch with him. He's like in his 80s and he's retired in Arizona. We'll send you his email and maybe he'll write to you." So I said, I would like that very much. And sure enough, George Morrison, he's still alive. He and his wife are retired now. He very kindly sent me several emails and we stayed in touch for quite a while. And again, just you could read all of this right now, but to summarize it briefly, he essentially confirmed the sighting. He provided some additional um, details. This was nothing conclusive. He was far enough away from whatever the object was that crossed the road that he couldn't have definitively said, I saw a Sasquatch. As he said, I saw the animal. He took off to the side of the road. He tried to look for footprints, but because he was taking someone to the airport, they were in a hurry to leave the park and he didn't have time. But he went back the next day and searched again where he thought the sighting had happened, was unable to find footprints. Now, Morrison, however, told me of several similar incidents that were reported in the park around that time by other maintenance employees and others that describe similar circumstances. His was not the only sighting that occurred during that time frame in Crater Lake National Park. We also had an interesting one that I found at Olympic National Park. This one from the 1990s. I first learned about this report courtesy of researcher David Politis of Missing 411 fame. I was able to very carefully discern what the case number was likely to be for this report, and I filed an independent FOIA request. And sure enough, I was able to get a copy, and this is a portion of the redacted FOIA file I received from Olympic National Park, where a group of picnickers on June 7th, 1993, all said that they saw a Sasquatch. Now, what's really intriguing, again, this creature was described as 6.5 to 7 feet tall, roughly 350 pounds. Some of the observers said that they weren't sure, but they thought it might have had a tail, but not all of them believed that that was the case. For the most part, though, the descriptions were consistent in that, and I quote from the document here, from a distance of about 200 yards, it appeared, though not well defined, as though the face were fur covered, the eyes deep set and bushy. It appeared to be very muscular in build and walked with its arms hanging out to the side of its body. The body had some resemblance to a gorilla, but not the head. Think back to the George Gibbs description of the Siatko from the mid-19th century. I mean, it's remarkable, the consistency to me. And yet again, despite some challenges that, well, early reports of Sasquatch-like creatures are just giant humans, actually, in my opinion, there's quite a lot of information from the last several centuries that describes very consistently large, hairy, human-like, but with distinctive characteristics like longer arms, vocalizations, very primate-like anthropoid apes. That's an incredibly fascinating thing, especially for those who would think otherwise, that there is no history establishing the existence of a creature like Sasquatch in America. I would say to the contrary, there is both some fascinating information in the historical record, and by doing some digging through FOIA requests and looking for both testimony from and documents from government employees, there's also some records to be found there as well. Very briefly here, I've also queried the U.S. Forest Service. This gentleman right here, John Mayenzinski, his story is well known. He's appeared on a lot of television programs, but I want to feature briefly. And Smiles, are we okay right now on time, by the way? I know we're probably running a little long. I don't know if, oh, there he is.
Yep. We're
We're good? Okay, cool. I tend to be a little long-winded, but this is important information, so we want to get it all out there in the record. John Mayenzinski had an encounter in the Wind River Mountains in 1972. At that time, he was working jointly, I think, for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, also the probably Bureau of Land Management, and there may have been a couple of other agencies because there were some joint programs involving sheep and things. But John is a true scientist and just an incredible individual, great musician too. And my team and I, who produced the Sasquatch Tracks podcast, we had the pleasure of being able to interview John Mayenzinski at length. He lives in you can see in the photograph right there, a very rustic cabin that he built. And he may not have running water or electricity, I'm not sure, but I know that he had to walk to a neighbor's house who had internet to be able to do the interview with us, which he did. And it was just delightful sitting and talking to him. In the audio soundbite I'm about to share with you, though, he discussed his experience and also how he ended up becoming involved in investigations into Sasquatch reports around that time, somewhat officially, under the auspices of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I queried him about those investigations and also specifically where the documents describing those experiences might exist. Let's hear this audio now.
There were a lot of people in the game and fish department that were interested. People that I knew, worked with, drank beer with after work. I'm very interested in these stories of a hairy primate in the Wind River Mountains and other places in Wyoming, in the Wyoming Range and some of the other mountains, Yellowstone Park, which is mostly in Wyoming. All these sightings were coming in now that I was tuned into that or tapped into that resource. I could get these sightings kind of funneled into me to investigate. So I was hearing most of the, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of stories. A lot of them happened on a reservation and they mostly wouldn't talk to me at that. But now they do, so I get reports all the time. When I turned that hair sample in, I went to the Game and Fish Lab as a part-time employee for the Game and Fish Department here in Wyoming. After we found out that it came back as a primate hair, but not a known primate, all the biologists and veterinarians I was working with that knew about this hair sample, and I wasn't particularly quiet about it. I thought this is the most interesting wildlife project I've ever heard of.
Yeah.
Yet nobody can get any funding to study it. So it's not going to get studied unless I do it personally. But technically our boss, the head of the research division for the Game and Fish Department, called us into the lab after he heard we had analyzed this sample, because word spreads, by word of mouth. He had heard that a hair sample came into that lab and was identified as primate hair. And he wanted all of us that were involved in that, head veterinarian Tom Thorne and myself, and the forensic veterinarian who actually looked at the hair under the microscope. He was the first one to identify it as primate hair. And we got chewed out. He told us to be there at a certain time. We were all sitting on the lab bench waiting for him to show up and joking and wondering what he wanted to see us about. And he just started coming in red-faced on the run, stood right in front of us and wagged his fingers at us, his finger at us. And he said, if I ever hear of any of you connected with the name Bigfoot, and you don't even have to utter it, if your name is connected with the word Bigfoot at any time in the future, I'm going to see to it personally that you're fired, one way or another. So the other two guys became silent after that. They still went to Bigfoot conferences on their own time, and I did too, but I was more vocal, and I just decided I really couldn't work for an age.
Okay, that sounds like the audio was ended right there. I have to say I admire John Meinzinski being told by his superior there, if I find out anybody was connected with this, and if I find out that you guys are out there investigating Sasquatch, it's going to be your job. And he says, well, you can have it. And he left. But in addition to the fact that there had been this very intriguing story he told about a primate hair sample that was found and identification made by the lab, and then he ends up being chewed out by his superior, and this causes him to end up leaving. As I had also alluded to, I asked John about those investigations and more specifically if records about them were kept. And this is what he had to say about that in the following audio soundbite during our interview. John, when the Forest Service was forwarding reports to you, do you know if there had been any records kept by that agency, or was this more or less an informal reporting process where they would collect these reports and then just call you and let you know?
Well, I'm probably not supposed to say this, but I am retired now. That the Forest Service had files that were somehow confidential files. I know everything nowadays is supposed to be open to the public, a federal agency like that. But I worked partly because of that and some other work I did. I was often employed by multiple agencies to do undercover work.
So he goes on to describe that, but briefly, just to recap what he's describing right there, he says, I'm probably not supposed to say this, but yeah, we were tasked with a variety of different things. And yes, indeed, there would have been records kept. And I pressed him on that a little, and I said, John, would those records be something that could be accessible today? And he says, if one knew where to look, yes. Now, I've made some inquiries toward trying to obtain some of those records, which include reaching out to the Denver National Archives to try and see if those, having been, more than 40 years old at this point, whether they would have been transferred to that facility. The process is still underway and has been a long-term project. I've also reached out to the individual different Park Service ranger stations and other areas where there are historical records kept. And there have been some FOIA documents released to me, but nothing that seems to document what, under the auspices of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as he described right there. Keeping in mind, he also worked with Bureau of Land Management and also Wyoming Game and Fish. There were several agencies, but that would have been U.S. Forest Service. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife, right? And he had said that those documents did exist. Now, that's significant to me because I know that at some point, documents that were conducted by an official body investigating this did exist. And so my suspicion that, much like with the UFO question, I don't think that there's anything about Sasquatch to the extent maybe that we have seen about UAP and data collected by the U.S. government about UAP over the last several decades. And the reasons are pretty obvious. I don't think Sasquatch, if it exists, would be deemed something that could potentially be a national security threat or could potentially represent a technology being used by a foreign adversary nation like China or Russia, right? We look at UFOs, I say we, the government, primarily to determine if there is a national security threat. And because there doesn't appear to be a national security threat associated with relict hominoids, if they exist, the government, if they collect information about this, probably does so on a much smaller scale relative to the kinds of agencies I've been probing, and primarily because A, people describe seeing things, B, some people like park naturalists like George Morrison or park rangers like Action Jackson and others were on the job and they had experiences, but they didn't necessarily file reports. I had to track down those individuals based on secondhand anecdotal data that I found, sometimes in histories about parks like the one that the Smith brothers collected, who put me in contact with the witnesses and who were able to substantiate the claims that had been recorded decades ago. So often it comes down to filing a report, finding that there are no, or filing a FOIA request, finding that there are no official documents, but ultimately that leads me to the individuals who saw this while in their line of duty as a U.S. federal government employee. Another fun discovery that was made through a FOIA request was one that I filed with Salt Fork State Park in Ohio. I filed a FOIA request looking for information about Sasquatch, and I get a phone call, and it's the park naturalist, John Hickenbottom. And he says, Mr. Hanks, we just got the most bizarre FOIA request I think I've ever seen at the park, and I'm sort of interested in Sasquatch. In fact, I listened to your podcasts. And I get to the bottom of the request and my eyes popped out of my head because then I saw your name and couldn't believe that you had filed this FOIA. And I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to call you and talk about this. So he calls. He's extremely helpful. We have many phone calls. In fact, I've gotten to know John and his entire family now. And I hope to get back up there later this year, but I've been to Salt Fork. John's taken me out on wilderness hikes in the park. John sent along all the data that he could personally find that the park has collected. There was nothing conclusive at all, but he has become, especially through getting to know me, even more interested in this topic. Several weeks after all that happens, I get an official message from the park, an attorney there with Salt Fork Park saying, I'm sorry, but we're denying your FOIA request. So I guess it helps to get to know the state park employees and the park naturalists because although, again, as a matter of policy, they said, we don't have anything and you're not getting it. The park employees themselves have actually been extremely helpful, and they've encouraged my interest and inquiries, and the Hickenbottom family have just become indispensable and wonderful friends as well. Now, I have to say, the FBI, it was recently revealed, by the way, that the FBI has a small group of people who are tracking UFOs. That's not a new revelation. It was actually referenced in the OD&I report put out in 2021 that the Federal Bureau of Investigation assisted at the time what was called the UAP Task Force. We could talk a lot about that, but interestingly, a few years ago, there was an official FBI file on Bigfoot that was made publicly available, and the story behind this is a fascinating one. It had been a researcher, an Irishman who had immigrated to the United States and ended up living here the rest of his life, Mr. Peter Byrne, a longtime well-known television personality and Bigfoot researcher, but he had been granted a hair sample by witnesses who believed that this was associated with the Sasquatch sighting they had had. And rather than just saying, okay, we may have a sample, Peter Byrne mailed the samples to the FBI laboratory and asked if they would do an analysis. And they actually wrote back to him and said the FBI laboratory conducts examinations primarily of physical evidence for law enforcement agencies in connection with criminal investigations, but occasionally, on a case-by-case basis, in the interest of research and scientific inquiry, we will make exceptions to this general policy. And so they did examine these hairs, and they determined ultimately that rather than Sasquatch, it was more likely they belonged to a deer. But after many decades, and Mr. Byrne unfortunately just passed away a couple of years ago, before his death, I was able to interview Peter Byrne about how the FBI helped him investigate Sasquatch. Briefly, I want to share a little audio from that
The
discussion.
FBI only recently released their documents, which illustrated how in the 1970s you had supplied some hair samples to their forensic lab for study.
That's true.
Yeah.
They've been a very good sighting, 2-day sighting, a Friday and a Thursday and a Friday. 2 men on one day, 2 men on the second day. And we were very lucky. We got it very quickly because sometimes we get a sighting 10 years later. Got it very quickly. And Saturday morning, went up to where they'd seen this thing, went up with the 2 men, and they showed me where it had been, and they showed me where it took off.
I think the audio stopped again there, but in essence, he just gives some additional context about the sighting. In the interest of time, we are almost at the end, but I don't want to run too long, and I want to make sure there's some time for questions. So we'll go ahead and, whoops. Okay, we'll skip ahead a little bit here. This is a case, I don't know if anybody there in the listening audience has Hulu, and if you may have seen a program called Out There, Crimes of the Paranormal. I appeared on that program talking about this case, the disappearance of a young boy tragically in 1969. This occurred in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. For many years, it was believed that there was an FBI file about this case, and there have been suppositions that have appeared online for years that somehow the child's disappearance may have been associated with the Sasquatch kidnapping. I can assure you, unfortunately, that there is probably no researcher who has filed more FOIA requests about the Martin case than I have, with the exception of maybe one other individual, and his name's Michael Bouchard. He's a retired police officer and a colleague of mine up in Connecticut, and we keep in touch about this case. David Paulides also, has done incredible legwork and really brought a lot of public attention to this in recent years when he covered this story in his first Missing 411 book. And I think that a lot of speculation about the case since then has propelled this idea of a potential Sasquatch kidnapping, with a lot of YouTubers and others really kind of getting into the mix and if not embellishing, projecting some interpretations onto newspaper accounts that appeared at the time that were recorded. David Paulides found a number of those and mentioned them in his books. But I mean, a lot of people have just taken those newspaper accounts and kind of, read into it that a Sasquatch may have kidnapped the boy. Now, Mr. Paulides certainly did go and look at the possibility that a wild man may have been involved, and was told by Ranger Dwight McCarter at the time that there were wild men living in the Smokies, but that these were not anything anomalous. These were men who were living off the grid. There was this FBI file that was known to exist. Many people had filed FOIA requests and tried to get it and had been unsuccessful. And so I tried numerous times to get the FBI file myself, and it was denied. And so on my behalf, my colleague, this is Tim McMillan, by the way, the co-founder with me at thedebrief.org, an excellent investigative reporter and an all-around good guy, but he's also a former police officer. And for a time between where he retired from law enforcement and then co-founded the Debrief with me, Tim also was working for a civil rights firm in Savannah, Georgia as an investigator. And at that time, he knew of my interest in this case, and he filed not only a FOIA request for me, but when it was rejected on my behalf, he filed an appeal to try and secure the release of the FBI file on the Dennis Lloyd Martin case, because many had speculated if there's any evidence of a Sasquatch kidnapping or something like that, it's going to be in that FBI file. Well, I can tell you it's not, because Tim was successful. We were the first to obtain the FBI file on the Dennis Martin case. It was subsequently uploaded to the FBI's reading room online. I got a phone call. I was in Brazil at the time, and I got a phone call when I got right back to the United States from Mike Bouchard, and he says, "I got the file." And I said, "I know, I did too." So Right around that same time, Mike Bouchard got it as well. And although there are some important things in the file, again, it dispels the notion, in my opinion, that there was anything associated with a Sasquatch at Cades Cove when this young boy tragically disappeared. Unfortunately, the program that I was on that I mentioned earlier really kind of plays up that idea, the idea of there being some monstrous creature that could have been involved in the kidnapping. I don't think that that's the case. And you'll see on that TV show that I was very much the skeptic on that program. And again, I maintain that all the documentation I've found about this case points in the opposite direction. It seems to have been a tragic disappearance of a child. We don't know what happened to him, but there's no evidence suggestive of anything anomalous in that case. Lastly, the United States Army. There are some individuals I've spoken with, no documents per se, but there are some individuals who I've spoken with who, under their line of duty under the Department of Defense, claim to have had experiences on military property with what we would call relict hominoids. This man right here, Todd Neese, is one of those individuals during a training exercise where they were detonating explosives. He and several other officers, including his superior officer, said that they saw more than one large hirsute individual in a field. And he has joined us also on the Sasquatch Tracks podcast to discuss that. I have a little audio, but I'm not going to play that right now in the interest of time. I do recommend that if you'd like to hear Todd's story, you can listen to that episode. And he's done a lot of interviews about this. And after his sighting, some years later, his superior officer came forward and has actually also joined Todd in some public appearances talking about what they said that they saw. As far as Sasquatch sightings go, I mean, it's pretty consistent with what we hear. It's nothing remarkable apart from the fact that here we have several Department of Defense employees who, in their line of training or in the line of duty while conducting training operations, said that they had this experience. So again, looking at the preliminary conclusions, there aren't very many government agencies that appear to be actively involved in serious Sasquatch research. We looked at why that would be the case earlier. I don't see this as being a serious national defense concern like UAP is. Whereas, by contrast, the Department of Defense currently has an office called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and they are actively investigating UAP. There are some rather biased and frankly conspiratorial journalists out there who have tried to argue that there's nothing to UAP, that the government's wasting its time, and everybody who's promoting belief in UAP are all grifters. It's really a very silly perspective, frankly, that I'm amazed that some of these people promote that, when what you actually see, if you look at it, is that the current director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, Dr. John Kozlowski, formerly with the National Security Agency, has gone on record and provided testimony before members of the Senate saying there are genuinely things we can't identify. And there are some really good cases that seem to describe anomalous aerial vehicles. So I'm very intrigued by what they're currently trying to resolve about those cases and what the nature of that phenomena may be. And it's easy to see why something that can fly and move at tremendous speeds, why that would be of interest to the DoD. I don't really think that Sasquatch is, but that doesn't mean that DoD employees haven't in some instances had their own experiences, as Mr. Neese has described there. Furthermore, government employees who have shared these stories include, as I mentioned, active military, U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service personnel, and others who are employed not only in federal government agencies, but also in state government agencies. And in addition to the federal government FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests I've filed, a lot of my inquiries have also been on the state level with what are known as just Public Records Act requests. The California Fish and Wildlife Department has a pretty impressive batch of files about Sasquatch they spent collecting, over many decades. And finally, after a few inquiries, I was able to get a copy of that file as well. Yet again, no proof, but there are some interesting stories that are collected in that. Similar files have been provided to me thanks to the people in Florida regarding the alleged skunk ape sightings there in the Everglades. Very interesting stuff, in fact. Although they are rare, the documents that have turned up in this initial inquiry have been successfully obtained through FOIA requests and through correspondence with government employees, with interviews I've done with these witnesses and other appeals for official information. And it has, although in a very small scale compared to the information about UAP and the abundance of it, it does show that there is some documentary evidence that can be obtained from government agencies related to the Sasquatch mystery, as well as the deeper historical data that extends back also to indigenous traditional beliefs. And that's why I say that we need to establish a new research unit, perhaps maybe with some Defense Intelligence Agency staff and maybe a little bit of, government funding. I propose we call this the Anomalous Anthropoid Theory and Investigations Program, or for short, ATIP. I think that has a certain ring to it. It'd be ideal for the continuing research into this. But in all seriousness, again, I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Smiles, and the entire team there at the Anomaly Archives for having me. This has been a lot of fun. Maybe next time we'll talk about UFOs, but it's been good to break away from that for a minute and talk about, I think, the very important research that needs to be done with regard to Sasquatch and some of the research I personally have been doing over the last couple of years and what little spare time I have. You can follow my work in the meantime over at thedebrief.org. You can also find our podcast about this topic, Sasquatch Tracks, at sasquatchtracks.com. And then finally, of course, my personal website is just micahhanks.com. And if I have time, and I love to hear from people, if you would like to email me, if you have questions afterward, I'd love to hear from you. But if we have time now, Smiles, I'm happy to try and answer a few questions now.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Micah. Really enjoyed that thoroughly. And I just especially appreciate your bringing your examples back around to examples that support the importance and the value to be found in actual archives. I think people often don't really give such repositories of data their due, and like so many things are kind of under threat these days. Yes, we can open the floor to questions. As stated at the beginning, you can type them into the chat, and if you want them to appear publicly, that they'll do so. And if you don't want your name or information put out there, just type anon, ANON, before your question. So far, we did have one question, but you answered it. So one of our frequent attendees was interested in whether you'd look for similar information in state parks, and they say thank you, which does remind me, I am wearing right now, because of course Sasquatch has become such an icon and a popular one at that. I am wearing, related to state parks, state of Texas, that has these t-shirts that have a Bigfoot image, and the Palmetto State Park is right near what's called Otine Swamp, which there are reports of an Otine Swamp thing, an Otine Swamp monster, going back some time ago. And of course, people give me this stuff. I bought that one myself because I visited it recently, and somebody recently gave me this other shirt.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's kind of almost a weird cyberpunk blue, weird, strange steampunk Sasquatch. There we go. But yeah, folks can put questions in the comments chat over there. I guess so. I know the answer from, as you say, you're getting into these subjects so long ago from childhood, and like so many of us, voraciously consuming what was available in your libraries that you had access to. When was your first attempt either for field research or FOIA type stuff with regards to the cryptozoology subject?
That, I know that referencing the email communication with the Crater Lake National Park employees, they had referenced that I'd filed that FOIA request in July of 2019. I think it was around that time. I know it was prior to COVID. At that time, there was sort of a nexus. We hadn't launched the debrief, but Tim McMillan and I were friends, and we were talking. We were kind of building up to the idea of launching something, which ended up happening in late 2020. And so in that period, I had been digging deeply into the Martin case. I'd been digging deeply into a lot of Sasquatch research, mostly the historical stuff. And you keep in mind, it was also, I believe, in 2019 that following the 2017 revelations, right, that occurred in the New York Times, in 2019, there was a follow-up that had been penned by the two authors, Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal, of the 2017 article, which first revealed to the public, they called it ATIP, and that was technically the unclassified nickname for the program, but the actual program being described was AWSEP, let's see here, the Advanced Weapon Systems Application Program. In 2019, the follow-up was where we saw Ryan Graves for the first time, and it described the incidents that occurred between the 2014-2015 period involving the USS Theodore Roosevelt off the East Coast, and that there had been sightings of anomalous aerial vehicles, strange radar traces, things along those lines. Some of these videos, of course, that we've seen, the so-called gimbal and go fast, also associated with that time period and those training operations. Seeing those in the New York Times and hearing about all this coverage obviously had been influential on me. And I was following UFOs already and had been for a long time, as you know. But I thought at that point, wouldn't it be interesting just to see if we might make some inquiries? And again, I started actually to answer Allison's question about state parks. Before I filed any federal FOIA requests, I believe I actually started with the state parks, and literally went to every state, began with their, whatever their equivalent to Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game, parks and recreation, or whatever, whatever the names of those agencies were, on a state-by-state basis. And each state usually has some equivalent to the Public Records Act request. Each state also has slightly different laws. And in some states, like for instance in Arkansas, they won't release Public Records Act request information from, I'm not sure if any agency will in Arkansas, at least according to current laws, to anyone except for Arkansas residents. You have to be a resident of that state to be able to get that information. Now, most other states, however, will, if I live in North Carolina and I file a request with California, they'll, comply with that, and they will provide data if it exists. Some agencies have been so exhaustive with the data they have provided that they would periodically provide just minutiae, just email after email after email that referenced Bigfoot. And I literally have closed some Records Act requests, much I'm sure to the enjoyment of those agencies that were having to go through all that stuff and try and send it to me. And I literally have just written to them and said, it's obvious that all you have in your holdings are emails where somebody, on a Tuesday said, it's like this guy believes in Bigfoot, and there wasn't much useful information. Once I can determine that there are no documents that are of, core significance to the kind of thing I'm looking for, I'll usually close those requests down just to save those agencies time. And I've seen them on social media, the park ranger and state park employees complaining about people filing FOIA requests. Some of those complaints may have been toward me. A lot of those agencies that have to handle the FOIAs, they're understaffed. They've got much better things to be doing with their time. So again, I try to be very respectful about this. And that's another one of the reasons why often the FOIA and record requests will lead to communication with individuals instead. So anyway, to answer your question, it began around 2019 using that essential strategy, extended from Records Act requests to FOIAs. I haven't been as active in it in the last couple of maybe years, I guess, for pretty obvious reasons with the debrief and everything. But there's still an ongoing effort. I'm still trying to track down some of the files like those described by John Myanzinski. I think that there's still quite a bit of work to do. And if anything, Smiles, it's like what you guys do with the Anomaly Archives. I don't expect I'm going to be the person who solves the Sasquatch mystery. And I don't expect I'm going to be the last person who follows this kind of approach to finding information. But what I do hope to try and do is to share some of what I've found and inspire others to use similar research tools and methods. And, a cumulative expansion of our knowledge can occur when more people cooperate and become involved. So that's really what I'm aiming to do.
Right on. Well, we have this question for those who use hallucinogens. How would you filter through their stories?
Sure, that's
going
a
out
question.
Going out in the forest,
Yeah,
eating some wild mushrooms.
There was a fascinating call that was placed to the National UFO Reporting Center back in the 1970s, where a person described a UFO-like experience, and Robert Gribble had been running the center at that time. And the way that Gribble interpreted that case, the witness seemed to be describing a hallucinatory kind of experience or something along those lines. you have to be careful when you're interviewing witnesses. And you have to always be prepared to accept. And unfortunately, I'll say with respect that I think a lot of researchers uh, overlook this. They go in and they think that if a person says they saw a Sasquatch or a UAP or whatever, well, let's take them at their word and interpret what they say they saw literally. In many cases, and I don't want to say most, but let's just say in many cases, people do tend to see what they want to see. And you have to be extremely aware of the fact that when someone believes they have seen something, their recollection of that experience may be extremely distorted. It may be a very distorted view on real world events. And I think that that's one of the reasons, again, why working with cases from park rangers, who, again, I highly doubt, I can't say it's impossible, but I find it highly doubtful that the park rangers at Yellowstone and other parks whom I have spoken with personally and who have shared their, stories, I find it highly doubtful that they were under the influence of hallucinogens at the time that they made those observations. And so again, the benefit of working with official sources like this is that it does provide, at least it's nothing rock solid, but it certainly does provide a little more legitimacy, and it helps to rule out the possibility that, as opposed to like a camper who might have been out there in the middle of the woods, who knows what they were up to or doing or what their perspective on reality may be. When I'm talking with a park ranger who has some experience in the field, who's used to seeing all the wildlife, you look at Bob Jackson, for instance, 30 years, he spent as many as he says 70,000 miles traversing the thoroughfare. He knows all the wildlife. He's constantly talking with people, and yet he saw an anthropoid ape-like creature, and on 2 occasions actually also heard vocalizations that didn't match any known animals in the park. And he's just one of the people I've spoken with. Again, the quality of that account provided by a person working in that official capacity as a federal government employee is, I think, significant compared to the average Joe who may not have that kind of skill set and experience.
Yeah, agreed. And so many of the accounts do tend to be by quote unquote unqualified observers. And I know obviously there's a ton of criticism of witness testimony, regardless of whether the witness is considered to be more reputable due to their skill set or their being held to a higher standard because their job is literally on the line. Now, just shifting slightly, I know you're from, well, I assume you're familiar with Texas' own Rob Riggs.
Oh yeah.
Who is one of those researchers who, may he rest in peace, who challenged the prevailing blood and gutter, nuts and bolts version of the mainstay of cryptozoology, of Bigfoot hunting, Sasquatch research, by entertaining ideas of a more paranormal nature, or like those of us in the UFO field who focus on high strangeness, these really strange aspects. I guess I could go in a couple different areas. I know you're also probably familiar with our friend Joshua Cutchin's ideas of the wilderness geist, this idea that so many of the strange aspects of cryptid encounters have this quality of if it had been in a spooky house, they would be described as a poltergeist.
Yeah.
I guess a way to connect these two is: have you come across anything in any of these documents or these federal or authority employees accounts of these kinds of encounters?
Not in the official documentation. The official documentation generally describes sightings of what appear to be apes. And I am of the opinion personally that if something like a Sasquatch exists, and I know that frustrates some people, Hanks, why don't you just say you believe? What's all of this? If they exist, nobody rides the fence better than Micah Hanks. I hear it all the time. But again, to truly approach this from a scientific perspective, which I try to do to the best I can when I'm discussing these topics, I cannot definitively say that these things are out there or that I know that they exist. Now, I've interviewed a lot of witnesses who say, I'm a knower, I'm in the knower camp. I know because I saw it. I just recently had an excellent conversation with my good friend Jeff, who lives over in Haywood County, and he's a longtime Bigfoot researcher with the Bigfoot Field Research Organization. Jeff has, his nickname we have for him, by the way, is Jeff Squatch. But again, he didn't come into this as a believer himself until he had a firsthand experience. And some of the stories he has shared with me of witnesses that he has interviewed are remarkable. And it seems to suggest to me that Jeff is a reliable witness who probably really did see something. And that if the accounts by witnesses shared with him that he has shared with me are true and accurate, they're remarkable. So I'm not a knower, but I know people who are, right? The government documents I have seem to describe similar things where there are people who say they saw something physical and tangible. And again, that's the equivalent for UFOs of like the nuts and bolts approach. But now if we're to get a little Magonian here for a moment, because I have a lot of time for Josh Cutchin, and anybody who knows or has seen Josh and I together at events, they know this. Josh and I are very, very good friends, dear friends. And in fact, I'm narrating his novel right now, the audiobook version of Them Old Ways Never Die.
Awesome.
So I can't wait to get done with it, only so that we can get it out there and share with the world. One of the first true collaborations that Josh and I have done, but our fates have been entwined for a long time. Josh, and Jeremy Renner, no, that was an actor. I'm sorry. Tim Renner, Josh and Tim Renner, they did that excellent, book, of course, where the footprints end. And a lot of people, and even Josh said to me, he says, I figure you and I are on different sides of the fence when it comes to Sasquatch. But I'm like, well, I am, and I always try to approach it from the nuts and bolts physical phenomenon. If Sasquatch exists, it's an anthropoid ape and an undiscovered species. But what we can definitely entertain is the fact that the idea of like the forest geist, or however Josh terms it, there are definitely phenomena that are similar to the poltergeist experience that some associate with Sasquatch. And that could be interpreted one of two ways. As my colleague Matt Pruitt would interpret this, it's people projecting supernatural qualities onto a physical creature. The other side of it could also be this. It could be when people are out there in the field looking for Sasquatch and they begin to experience things happening around them. A possible wood knock, a strange sound, something threw a pine cone at me, Sasquatch. None of those things may be associated with Sasquatch at all. And in fact, many people, when they go into haunted houses, I know this as a reformed ghost hunter myself. And by the way, I'm fascinated with ghosts. My younger brother is now doing an excellent podcast that deals primarily with ghosts called Ghosts in the Mountains. We've both always been fascinated with that since childhood. But I've been on a lot of ghost hunts, and I've been in a lot of haunted houses with people where they're saying, did you hear that? Did you see that? There's a ghost right here in the room with us. And I'm seeing a lot of different things like temperature changes causing creaking doors and creaking, wood in the floors that pops very loudly like my brand new house tends to do. I don't think my house is a 2024 build in that it's haunted, but it does all those things under the right temperature conditions. In other words, humans tend to experience things, and when they can't explain them or if it spooks them, we can often project things onto it. We can assign agency to those phenomena. And one interpretation, and I think he would agree with this, is that whatever the phenomena is that we associate with the ghost, right? If I'm in a haunted house, sure, if I really want to have an experience with ghosts, I'm probably going to have one. Many people, they go into the forest and they also have Sasquatch experiences. They never see a Sasquatch, but they have all of those hallmarks, the poltergeist-like phenomena that happen. And to me, this is interesting because Josh and I have talked about this. Jacques Vallée wrote back in the 60s, Passport to Magonia. What he started trying to do was go deeper down the rabbit hole, go back into history and see if UFOs are something that have been with us far longer than the modern UFO era, right? And the nuts and bolts purveyors of this, would have us believe. And he did find a lot of very good historical accounts that seem to describe aerial phenomena that's very familiar to modern UFO readers throughout the centuries. You'll notice I'm sort of doing the same thing with Sasquatch. And you'll also notice that Jacques Vallée is very open to the possibility that UFOs are not necessarily extraterrestrial visitors. He believes they may be something much more complex. He even has often drawn parallels between modern UFO reports and the ideas of like fairy folklore from the British Isles and traditions involving the Fae or other supernatural beings. The deeper you go into Sasquatch research, you will inevitably begin to encounter reports that are not as easily reconcilable with the great big dumb ape hypothesis. I don't know what that means. I have ideas. And again, I've referred to my colleague, Matt Pruitt, and the supernaturalization of known animal species as one possible mechanism for explaining that. But I think that more broadly, whatever the actual meaning is, we should acknowledge that that happens as part of the human experience, and that in the deeper history of the study of any of these anomalous phenomena, you're going to encounter those things. And now we have to just try and interpret and analyze that. So without drawing conclusions about are these things supernatural creatures, I'm going to say that's an undeniable component of beliefs involving them, but that is an artifact of human belief in the phenomenon. And that is not something new. Just like with UFOs, it extends much further back into time. And I only took you into the 1700s. With Sasquatch, we could go all the way back probably to the earliest writings that humans have kept, which maybe will be a topic for a future lecture here for the Anomaly Archives.
Well, thank you for that. We have another question. Riley asks, is there anything about the Sasquatch observation that changes over time, like what we might see in the UFO phenomenon?
Interesting question. So UFOs, again, what seems to have occurred over time is, when Foo Fighter sightings were first reported, by Allied pilots over Europe, they were describing little spheres and things. Then in the 40s, we start seeing saucers, and throughout the 50s, flying saucers become UFOs. On up to the 60s and the 70s, we continue to hear about UFOs, but by the 80s and 90s, we start seeing reports of big triangles, right? Abductions also start happening. In other words, there are trends that seem to occur throughout time that represent changes in the way that both we perceive the phenomenon and also that the ways that the phenomenon appears to manifest or behave. When it comes to Sasquatch, though, I've got to be honest, and again, I should say Relict Hominoids, because a lot of the more historic accounts I've come across are not North American sightings because, for obvious reasons, pre-Columbian traditions are often, cited by Sasquatch researchers as historical accounts, but in truth, there should be, with respect to the indigenous traditions that we're talking about, there should be a distinction made between the beliefs, the cultural beliefs of groups in North America, which they take great pride in, and therefore I want to contextualize those appropriately with respect to those groups, versus historical documentation in various parts of the world describing these things. The account we had from the 1790s of Mozino's description provided to him of the Matlocks, that is a historical account describing an indigenous traditional belief. George Gibbs did the same thing with his accounts of the Siatko. We start seeing historical accounts really appearing in 19th century newspapers in North America. But if we look at historical accounts from other parts of the world, there are descriptions of creatures very similar to Sasquatch that appear in like the Hunan province, I think in like the 300s AD. I've found some very intriguing ones that I actually shared with Cliff Barrickman and Matt Pruitt for an episode of Bigfoot and Beyond that they were very impressed by. And Cliff, of course, when he was filming Finding Bigfoot, had gone to China and had actually discussed some of the beliefs in the Yeren, or the wild man there. And so he was very intrigued by some of the historical Chinese accounts that I found through actual translation of early Chinese accounts, mostly medicine books and things that describe people's encounters with man-like creatures in the mountains there. There was another interesting encounter that was provided by, I believe his name was Schaffenberg. He was where was he from? I'd have to go back and look at the account, but I believe it's from the 1500s, where while serving the Khan of Tibet, he ends up hearing this account of these two hairy people that were brought in from the desert who lived like animals in the forest. And again, there are all these interesting historical accounts over time. And the fascinating thing to me about those is that in whatever part of the world, there may be some minor differences in the general description, but for the most part, it's very consistent. We're talking about hair-covered humanoids. Often they're very large, but sometimes their size can be in proportion to the extremity of the environment. In other words, the larger ones tend to be in colder environments or more harsh and rugged environments. Those who live in more temperate regions or where the climate isn't quite as unforgiving, they may just be essentially human-sized. But the general consistency is, a little larger than humans, covered in hair. There's not a tail. There aren't horns. There aren't, fangs. There aren't wings or something extraordinary. And so to answer that question, the consistency of the sightings of relict hominoids from various parts of the world throughout time that I've found are remarkably consistent. And to me, if this was a mythology and these were entirely creations, of the human mind, I would expect that there would be more tails and wings and fangs and horns and other extraordinary characteristics. One thing that is an interesting outlier, it's actually very consistent again, and we even heard this in the report from the two USGS scientists that were entering Yellowstone in the 1970s. They tend to describe eye shine, and I've talked with Jeffrey Meldrum about this and others, and most anthropologists and primatologists understandably do not think that Sasquatch would or should have eye shine, tapetum lucidum, because primates don't have that membrane, that reflective membrane that causes that. They aren't nocturnal animals that see in the dark. Primates, that is. Now, there is one variety of primates, a certain variety of lemur, that does have tapetum lucidum. But Sasquatch, in many descriptions, seems to have eye shine, which is a really interesting thing. And I have wondered, is it possible that, unlike other primates, that this could be a nocturnal primate that actually has evolved that and does display eye shine like most mammals who are nocturnal animals, bear, heck, alligators, although the reptiles, the color of the eye shine is very different from those of mammals. It'll be more reddish, whereas it's orange with deer, bear, animals like that, raccoons, etc. Some of them have a yellow or even a greenish color. That's often described with Sasquatch. And the interpretation ranges from maybe it's just light reflecting off the eyes. It's not actual tapetum, the actual eye shine phenomenon, which primates aren't supposed to have with the exception of those lemurs. I don't have an answer to that question, but it's an intriguing conundrum that is a feature that's described so often. Last point really quickly too, Smiles. There's even a similar description provided in Beowulf, where as Grendel's coming into the hall during the fight between Grendel and Beowulf, Grendel's eyes are described as giving off a baleful glow like candles in the various descriptions. I'm referring probably to the Haney translation there. And furthermore, if you go back to the original early English translations or the pre-translations, there's a description, a word that is used for Grendel, skeodegenga, which literally translates to mean night goer or he who moves in the dark. So it seems to describe a nocturnal human-like creature that has these shining eyes that reflect light. That's a very fascinating thing that comes up so often. And so to answer that question yet again, the descriptions seem to be remarkably consistent, right down to those weird little details.
And wasn't the organization you were first involved with called Lemur?
Yeah, it was. That was with Joshua Warren back in the day, the League of Energy Materialization and Unexplained Phenomena Research. Yep.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our attendees, and but thank you, Micah, for being so passionate about these many different subjects that you've tackled in your career so far. And I just really value your contributions to all these different milieus of the paranormal, the Fortean, the anomalous. It's just always a pleasure to hear you talk about this, not just because you have such a soothing voice, but because you are so articulate and have done the real work necessary to have good, solid foundations of information about these subjects. And I just always look forward to every new podcast and just continue to be proud and happy to see someone like yourself really just always taking it to the next level. And
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Smiles. That means a lot coming from you, and you're someone I equally respect and admire and I appreciate. And, if I can ever find the time, because I'm a science journalist by day and we're covering the latest James Webb Space Telescope discoveries and defense and science news there at the debrief. But, if I can find the time to break away, I do hope to complete a couple of books, one about the history and one about the government side of all this. It's going to be two separate books about this subject that I hope maybe in the next year or so to be able to get out. If I may just share one final parting word, again, everything I said at the beginning was very true and sincere. I admire the work that you're doing. I encourage everyone to please support the Anomaly archives. Obviously, people who are here are doing that. And I just encourage everyone to put it out there, share it with your friends. If it comes up when you're having beers with someone over the weekend and they're intrigued by the anomalous, or they're just a history buff and they enjoy that side of it, or science, reporting. Obviously, I've got a finger in each of those pies, but it's important stuff, and encourage people to support what the Anomaly Archives is doing. Put them in touch with Smiles, because we have to preserve our history. We have to preserve information for future generations. That's a large part of what we talked about tonight. We wouldn't know any of this if there weren't diligent historians out there doing just that. And we can all play a part in doing that today so that the information from yesterday is preserved today and people will have it tomorrow. It's incredibly important. Please support what they're doing.
Thank you for that. Folks, I highly recommend you check out all of Micah's projects and podcasts. You can go, of course, to his website, micahhanks.com, and, of course, the news site, thedebrief.org. Great stuff, always there. And Micah, if you can stick around after we end the show, I'll chat with you briefly. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you next month. Good night, everybody.